everyone. I am Johanna Grossman, Head of Healthcare and Life Sciences Capital Markets at the New York Stock Exchange, where I work with private companies looking to go public. On behalf of the Society for Immunotherapy of Cancer, I'd like to welcome you to our Biotech Virtual Program Series. Today, we're diving into what it truly takes to fund early-stage biotech companies in cancer immunotherapy, a field defined both by its promise, but also its challenges. Our goal is to explore how investors do three things. The first is discover innovative biotech startups in cancer immunotherapy. The second is evaluate the scientific and business potential of these high-risk, high-reward ventures. And the third is how they support companies as they navigate the complex journey from concept to clinic. I'm thrilled to be joined by two exceptional guests who bring a wealth of experience from both the investment and scientific sides of biotech. First, we have Dr. Nandita Shangari, Managing Director of Arti Capital. Nandita brings deep expertise from both the investment and operational sides of biotech. Also with us is Dr. Artavazd Arumov, Principal at Qiming Venture Partners USA. Arti brings a unique blend of experience in cancer biology, clinical research, and biotech business development. Together, we'll unpack the critical questions facing early-stage biotech founders and investors. To our audience, thank you for joining us, and let's get started. To kick things off, can each of you share a little bit about your backgrounds and your firms? Nandita, why don't we start with you?
Great. Thank you so much, Johanna. So I'm Nandita Shangari. As Johanna mentioned, I'm a managing director with Arti Capital. I joined Arti about 2 years ago. Prior to joining Arti, I was at Novartis for a very long time. I had various different roles at Novartis. I started there right after my PhD in biochemistry, worked in preclinical safety, then went into more clinical development and program strategy, was part of the Qiming team, and then moved into business development and licensing and was part of the Novartis Venture Fund before moving over to Arti Capital. The reason for my move to Arti Capital was because Arti is a multi-strat fund. We fund companies all the way from concept. So we have an incubator called Raven, where we can incubate companies and ideas and have venture partners and EIRs who we work with to come up with new co-concepts. We also have a group within Raven called Condor, where we're able to bring in licensed assets from pharma and build new cos around those assets. And at the same time, we have, we can do financings as early as seed, series A, B, C, like we can go all the way till IPOs and then also in the public market. So bringing in that level of capital across the life cycle of a company gives us a little bit, gives us a lot of flexibility of how to invest in companies at various stages of their development. At the Arti also has a Tech Atlas group, which allows us to do a lot of indication analysis work, understand white spaces where we can build companies, and also how we should invest in the new codes, in the opportunities that we're looking at. So that's a little bit about me and a little bit about Arti. And our check sizes vary because we can invest at various different stages, and we're here to help our companies all the way through. So we do love to take board seats and support our companies that way.
Great. And we're going to unpack a little bit about that in the further questions. But before that, Arti, why don't we introduce yourselves?
Yeah. Thanks again for having me, Johanna. Arti Arumov. I'm a principal with Qiming Ventures USA. I joined the team a little bit over four years ago. My whole career prior to becoming an investor has been in precision oncology. I started my career at the bench at Mount Sinai in ovarian cancer research and discovering new targets and elucidating the underlying genetics. Multiple roles since then, both in my PhD work at University of Miami in lymphoma, leukemia, and solid tumor malignancies in the tumor drug addiction space, antibody drug conjugate space, and bispecific engager space. Had the privilege of being at Sloan Kettering in clinical research, where I had a firsthand look at what it takes to not only help thinking through designing phase 1 and phase 2 trials where you hold the IND as the institution, but working with sponsor pharmaceutical companies like Eli Lilly, Pfizer, and of the likes, and really understanding what it takes to push a medicine forward for the brave patients who come in and sign up for those medications. Immediately before joining Qiming, I was heading up business development at a computational chemistry startup called Redesign Science, which we spun out of NYU. Very exciting times. Obviously, the computational chemistry space has evolved extensively since then, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about that today, since it does seep through a little bit more and more these days into the IO space, especially in the antibody world. And so, really privileged to be chatting with both of you today, and then of course with the SITC audience, and hopefully having a great discussion. A little bit about Qiming. So we are a early stage therapeutics focused fund. So we opened up officially in 2017 and are now investing out of our third fund. We unfortunately don't have the privilege of going across everything like RA does. So we kind of chose our niche a little bit, if you will, of being at the earlier side of things. So the thesis of the fund is very much to be, the first check that comes into an effort. That can be everything from a new co-incubation spinning out directly from an academic institution, working side by side with an investigator, all the way through to a more classic seed, Series A or Series B stage financing, where we look to write checks up to $15 million as the first check, usually for a board seat, hopefully also with an observer seat. With the fund of $260 million, which is what we're investing out of currently today, which is our third fund. There's only so many bets that we're going to take. So we generally pride ourselves and think of ourselves as operationally minded, execution minded folks who've all sat across the spectrum of biopharma and research prior to becoming investors, and try to bring that thought leadership and execution expertise in the day-to-day activities, whether it's in the boardroom or rolling up our sleeves and momentarily stepping into companies. We've had the privilege of investing in lots of different oncology companies, and certainly ones in the IO space that are at the cusp of what we think are going to be new solutions for patients. So excited to be chatting more about a lot of really cool things on the agenda today with a phenomenal cast of folks here. So thanks again for SITC for sponsoring this.
Great. So why don't we start with you, Arti, especially since you're focused more on that earlier stage. And let's talk a little bit about how you discover companies, especially with so many immunotherapy cancer companies emerging. How do you spot the opportunities that really stand out? Is there a particular lens or framework that you guys decide, which startups to take a closer look at?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's kind of multiple layers to that, so we could try to piece them apart. I think the first one, which is just full stop, the ethos of our fund, we spend about 90% of our investments into what we'll call drug development companies. So these are companies with platform technologies or pipelines of assets, irrespective of where they come from. They can be incubated originally at a university. They could be coming from China. They could be coming from Europe. We don't necessarily discriminate on the origin of the program. And really the focus of the fund is generally to deploy capital into medicines that hopefully will, solve for unmet needs and solutions that patients are looking for. When it comes time to forming specific hypotheses and theses, and I think we'll hear a little bit more from Nandita as well, as this concept of white spacing. We do quite a lot of prospective, proactive mapping on what are the emerging trends that may be coming up. Obviously, like many other investors, we wait for people to come to us too, and of course we take a lot of those meetings, and we'll chat a little bit about what that checklist looks like later today. But in the scope of looking for that next thing, we can think back to examples like in vivo CAR T, which I think both of us have been involved in our respective investment roles to some extent, where back around 2017, 2018, you started to see some real signs of data that suggested there was a new frontier, on the horizon. In this case, solving for a problem that was both cost of goods and patient access related. And so, that ultimately blossomed into companies like Emoja, Capstan, and many others that, of course, have pioneered a new field. But most of that work spawned, out of academic institutions and what we'll call new endeavors that, were coming across the desk of investors like Qiming and RA and Novartis at the time. I think that in the white space exercise category, using that as an example, it's this idea of forming a thesis on what could potentially be a new trend that can be either solving for a very specific technical problem either increasing specificity, increasing selectivity, again, improving on cost of goods in the in vivo, CAR-T example, or patient access. And then really trying to be proactive on understanding, has the industry, whether that's academia or professional entrepreneurs, move the ball forward enough to converge on the moment being right for an investment. And we may talk about this a little bit today, but there is a timing and serendipity effect that happens. And if you're chasing the market trend, you'll almost always lose. So you kind of have to double down on yourself as an entrepreneur when you're working in your respective areas, because it's almost impossible to predict what the next trend may be, right? But really looking for, looking to form these theses in as specific of a way as possible, going really deep and mapping the landscape of who's working in those specific categories across the ecosystem, talking to those folks, trying to meet the companies if there are any, and then making a decision. Is it time? And if it is there a company, or do we have to build it from scratch, and not being afraid to do that? But it starts with specificity on the thesis and the subject matter at play, for sure.
Nandita, what about you guys? When you're evaluating companies at that early stage, what does your due diligence process look like? And do you have a checklist, or, can you walk us through how you evaluate those opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. So very similar to what Arti kind of went through, but really the first thing we look at is, what is the scientific need? What is the unmet need that we're solving, and how much of scientific rigor is actually in here? So specifically for like IO, like, is the immunological mechanism actually clear, right? What kind of immune cell types are being like engaged or modulated here? Like what's the upstream effect and drivers? What's the tumor context? What kind of a data anchor do we have here? What kind of checkpoints, like, checkpoint for differentiation are we doing? Like, what is the clinical path, et cetera? Like, we look at all of those things as like the first thing to kind of see if there is an actual there. And, this whole concept of the white space mapping, that is very important, because it's about like, do we actually like understand, what are the things that failed before, and why this opportunity is actually differentiated, and what is the need that it will be serving. The other thing we look very, very carefully on is actually IP position and how strong it is, and can we actually defend it, and what can we build on top of it. And regulatory path clarity is like key to be able to see how realistic the clinical development timelines will be, and what the endpoint strategy looks like. The other thing that's important is understanding the capital efficiency and what the plan is to actually be able to get you to a value inflection point. Those are very important. The team is important in terms of founder credibility. But also the execution team is something that we can help build. So knowing who within our ecosystem could help take this further also helps us kind of think through, hey, is this something that we actually want to invest in today?
That makes sense. And actually staying with you, Nandita, are there certain things that, from everything that you said, that you absolutely have to see before moving forward? Or, do you weigh any of those particular pieces higher than others?
So I think if we're thinking about it from the IO perspective, I think the key thing for us really is that, is there a compelling mechanism, right? There must be a plausible biological like rationale that you have to kind of go through, and that addresses like a failure mode that hasn't been looked at previously. We really need to look for IO specifically, what the biomarker plans are, and then what kind of translatability for in vitro and in vivo data there is. So those are kind of key from the IO perspective. And then more generally, right, like for us, like I was mentioning, like the idea is like trying to understand and making sure that there is actually a good clinical development path, so that, you're not getting, once you've actually put resources in place and you're like getting past the preclinical stuff, you can actually get yourself to a proper clinical endpoint.
Arti, let's talk a little bit about red flags, especially when you're meeting with teams, and founders. Are there any red flags that instantly make you want to walk away from an opportunity, even if you really truly love the science?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if there's a right answer, but I would say the answer that really turns me off is there is no competition and we are the only ones in the space. Whether you truly believe that or not, I think is up for debate, but in actuality, there's always a competitor, and the competitor may be someone who's directly competing with you, kind of equal potent in sense of the technology is the same, the approach is the same, or it could be an indirect competitor, right? Competition can be other people vying to make a drug for the same patient population that you're vying to, solve problems for. Competition could be trying to modulate the same biological axis, but from a different entry point than the immune cell or other, marker that you're interrogating. And of course, competition can be as direct as doing exactly the same thing. And whether it's talking with prospective, folks coming out of academic institutions that are trying to spin out companies, or frankly established, executives that are successfully building those companies with the track record. I think the thing that separates sometimes the seasoned folks from the ones who are still learning is the appreciation that this is a difficult space and there's a lot of smart people working to solve these problems, and you always have someone who's maybe trying to box you out. And we'll get into it a little bit later, but knowing your enemy in that sense, if we're going to use that term in this example, is actually the best thing that you can do, because it starts to let you differentiate and actually come away with a really compelling argument when talking to investors and prospective funding agencies. And I just always struggle when within the first few minutes, you start asking, well, how does this compare to X, Y, and Z? Because we know, right? Our job is to understand the landscape, whether it's prospectively mapping, like both of us in both of our groups do, or, doing diligence. Doing diligence is in some ways understanding the whole competitive moat, and we inevitably will always find somebody who's thinking about it. So it may seem like a silly question, but I think it's one that definitely is a little bit of a flag when it's like, no, I'm the only one and there's nobody else. Trust me, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess in that process, you also discover a lot of new companies. So I guess my follow-up question to that is, where do most of the opportunities that you look at come from? Are you proactively scouting for new companies, or do you tend to rely on your network, or is it like inbound pitches from founders? Like, where do you typically find, the companies that you're looking at?
Yeah. Well, I think first and foremost, with both of us on the call, our network is a very big currency, right? It's a small ecosystem, and generally speaking, we know our colleagues, we know our peers, we know our friends who have specific things that they're looking for. Part of the job is to keep an active dialogue with investor colleagues and speak firm to firm, individual to individual. And so, not surprisingly, and we could say it here, right, Nandita, that we've shared across each other and in opportunities that we're respectively looking at, whether it's our portfolio companies or new opportunities that we may be considering. And frankly, trying to see, is there a way to potentially work together? And obviously, that starts first with the science, technology, and unmet need and execution. I'd say beyond the network piece, which I think is inevitable, right? And maybe we could talk later about how does a prospective founder break into getting recognized and seen by the network. But like I mentioned, we do a lot of white spacing activities and forward-looking thesis building. And as part of that, that's actually a lot of outreach on our part to folks who are working in the space. And so if we're, looking into, tertiary lymphoid structures and B cells, right? There's a small list of people who are amazing experts like Tullio Bruno and Hervé Friedman and Adi Barzel and others, James Voss, who do amazing work in those spaces. And so it behooves us to go and email them, right? No different than, somebody may be emailing us cold and asking for a meeting. At least we do that all the time, and look for sourcing those types of opportunities and going directly to the source. And I'd say on a personal note, I have the privilege of being on a number of different academic grant advisory boards where, especially in today's trying times with the NIH funding, it's more relevant than ever, where institutions are putting some of their own capital at work to bridge the gap for projects internally, whether that's at Sloan Kettering, Cornell, University of Miami, where I have some personal relationships through those advisory mechanisms, where I'm asked to come into the room to help evaluate an opportunity for, deciding should we award that group anywhere between $50,000 to $500,000 for critical experiments that will help bridge the research commercialization gap. And embedded in that is a natural relationship that starts to get built, right? If we see something exciting, if I see something exciting, then that naturally starts to become an opportunity that not only would we evaluate at Qiming, but maybe I'll send over to RA Capital and say, hey, I just heard these folks talk about this amazing new opportunity. I think you should go have a chat with them. So, really, really thoughtful from a university perspective as we're seeing more and more of those mechanisms being put up.
Nandita, what about you? Obviously, the network with Arti.
Yeah, no, there's definitely the network effect, right? Like the network effect is very huge. And you get that from, talking to the investors, being on boards of companies, and also through scientific advisory boards of your companies, et cetera. So you're able to like tap into that network, which is a really big thing. I think the other thing for us is specifically coming from like the Raven incubator, right? We have a lot of venture partners who we like work with to build out new companies. And again, to the same thing, that Arti kind of brought up was around this white space. Like we work through like what are the big things that are like happening right now where you're seeing some level of like thoughts that are like coalescing. So right now there's a lot of work being done on specific T cell depletion, like going after specific subtypes of T cells. So we've been thinking through that and trying to figure out if we can like, one of our venture partners is very deep on the immunology side. They're like thinking through what's the best way to build a company around that. What is the target analysis that we need to do to be able to go into a space like that? So we can build based on that. We can also build, like I said, based on opportunities that we're getting from like pharmas, et cetera, or even now we're thinking about things. If we keep a target list together to try to understand if there's certain targets that we can go after. It may be that certain targets are very hard to go after because of just the way the proteins are structured, et cetera. But if there is a breakthrough in one of the potentially in a platform tech that could allow us to access those targets, like we'd be able to like go after those now. So there's a lot of work that we do to try to like have our knowledge base built so that we can look at the external environment and see where things can kind of fit in. And also, of course, there's the whole there's the whole aspect of the network in general. And we haven't accessed the academic potential as much as I think Arti has, and that's an area we would like to do more in, especially like having discussions with TTOs, et cetera, because they generally like to run these specific like research days where you can go and like look at all the different PIs and the work that they've been doing.
That's great. I think a lot of great information for the listeners today. We talked a lot about how you discover companies. So why don't we move towards how you evaluate companies, and specifically, right off the bat, what are some of the common mistakes you see founders make when they are pitching? Arti, you mentioned, saying that they're the only ones in the space. Anything else you'd like to add? And then maybe Nandita would love to hear about, what sort of mistakes you see founders make as well.
Yeah, maybe there's a few, but I think the one that kind of resonates the most, thinking back to my own perspectives of having been a founder trying to pitch to investors, is not only is it knowing your competition, but then also perhaps the misconception that your investor audience doesn't understand the technicalities of what you're talking about. Obviously every firm and every individual at a venture capital firm is built differently. And I think we would encourage everybody listening to this to look up the individuals you're going to be speaking with before you go into a meeting, because almost intuitively, if you're going to be speaking to someone who's a cancer immunologist, hypothetically speaking, then you should be prepared to answer deep technical questions that you may be getting from your peers in an institution or in an entrepreneurial setting. And so I think that's a roundabout way of saying that within the competition angle and knowing who else is out there, it's actually also understanding the data that you think would need to be generated and going through that type of data that you've already generated or you're going to be generating in a way that is scientifically and technically accurate and very clear and succinct. and not, just business terms, right? I think this concept of we're pitching to business people who only understand the business concept is fair, and there is a whole component of how do I build a company and execute for value and in a way that investors see it, but especially for earlier stage efforts, which I think most of the audience here is likely a part of. It actually starts with the technical science, right? So it's somewhat the same pieces that you spend time thinking about in your day to day, except now you're pitching in a way that's not an academic seminar or a educational seminar. You're now pitching why this depletion methodology with the bispecific T-cell engager is going to overcome an antibody drug conjugate approach for a similar set of targets, and having the right data to back up, the hypothetical target product profile that you're looking to achieve. And that's why you're talking to us and trying to raise money and trying to build a company. So I'd say within the confines of knowing competition is knowing, being comfortable enough to understand the technicalities of the data you're trying to beat. And I often see that sometimes that gets a little bit lost in pitches. And if that point doesn't get across, then there may not be, unfortunately, a second call, right? Because the message is kind of missed, right? That key home run data, if you will, that kind of speaks to the value, right? So connecting the problem to the solution in a way that's not just high level, if that makes sense. I don't know, Nandita, what would you say?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that's kind of the key, right? And then, one of the things we've kind of seen is also generally what we end up seeing is people, as Arti is saying, they end up underestimating the competition and the regulatory complexity. The other thing we kind of find is that sometimes people end up not really being very rigorous on the timelines and the capital needs. Those are very, very important on the investor side of things, where we're trying to understand exactly what quantum of capital gets you to a value inflection. So understanding exactly what you are delivering and the amount of capital you're asking for, and if that is actually going to move the needle, is very big. To be able to do that is very important. And essentially, being very, very clear on, especially as you build complex therapeutics, being very realistic on what the manufacturing and CMC challenges are, because sometimes we see that, especially if things are coming out of the academic side of things, you don't really understand, there's quite a bit of gap from going from an academic process to trying to understand how you're going to create a consistent process in a drug-like setting, right? So we need to work through those as well. I think one of the things that I've also seen, a lot that I've seen happen a lot is around the preliminary data as being shown as being something that has been shown as being oversold, and trying to, when you're actually presenting your data, to present it in context of all the things that need to happen to really get you to value. This is this is one step towards the rest that you need to take. And yes, you've de-risked some, but there's a significant amount of de-risking that is still probably ahead of you.
I'd say maybe to reinforce that, you mentioned this earlier, Linda, the mechanism.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any sector of life sciences where biological mechanism is as important as it is in IO, because the drug is the immune cell, generally speaking, in most instances, and that's a living, drug that is designed to do a certain activity that's not just, if we're using the example of an antibody drug conjugate, for example, or a radiopharmaceutical agent, delivering a toxin or a nuclear warhead of some sort to just blow something up, right? Where in that case, mechanism is important, of course, too, but I would argue maybe less so than modulating a living, dynamic, rheostatic thing. And so I think that's really, really important is with folks in the IO industry needing to complement their phenotypic outcome data, whatever that is preclinically, to your last comment, and is it with actual mechanism to back it up, I think is super, super critical.
I wanted to follow up, Nandita, on something you said with regards to the regulatory strategy and plan of a company. How like how does that play into your evaluation of companies? Their strategy, their sort of regulatory strategy play.
Yeah, so regulatory strategy is key. So this is something, given like my drug development experience coming from like preclinical and doing the clinical work, it's one of the key things that was like instilled in me to like think about fairly early on. And it's one of the things that I would say even within like RA, like we have a regulatory and clinical development group that really works with our companies to be able to help them really put together plans and timelines and essentially like pressure test like is their clinical development plan actually one that can result in meaningful clinical data. So it's critical to building the thesis for our investment, especially in IO, where like endpoints are evolving, right? Like rapidly, and companies really need to think about what their FDA interaction strategies would look like. It's not just about the protocols, but also thinking through like how early should you be accessing the health authorities, be it the FDA or EMA, et cetera, to be able to get an early indication of does your plan actually make sense? Because you want to understand if a combination trial is needed, what is the complexity there, and you want to make sure you have the right clinical experts in place as well. So to me, this is one of the key things for at least for like when I'm looking at a company, it's how do you actually get it to the point where you're getting human data that is actually meaningful from a safety and efficacy point of view.
Okay, so let's change gears a little bit and let's come up with a sort of hypothetical situation here, Arti. You found the company you like. It's a little early,
Yes.
and it lacks robust animal and clinical data.
Okay.
How do you assess and balance that risk? And are there any creative ways that you have found that founders de-risk their story at that stage?
In the absence of maybe missing the home run experiment, the experimental data.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel like that's like the purgatory zone that almost everybody lives in, right? And until you just get what the thing that you're looking for. So it's probably a thing that everybody has to deal with on both sides over and over. I'd say from the founder side, there's, and again, if we're catering more towards early stage prospective spinouts, there's, plethora of mechanisms that you just kind of have to know what you're looking for, right? There's, of course, non-dilutive funding that is offered through small business grants through the NIH, SBIRs, STTRs, which in some instances require academic affiliation. In some instances, they don't, and you can completely separate yourself and license the technology on your own behalf. I think I mentioned earlier that, we have the privilege, and I have the privilege of sitting on several academic advisory boards. So would encourage founders to ask their tech transfer office and their innovation teams, hey, are there internal mechanisms to help me de-risk my experimental designs? And more often than not, I think people will find, surprisingly, that there are, right? There's usually pockets of money available for projects that are specifically in that purgatory zone, right? They've shown just enough to be exciting and interesting from the context of a commercial or competitive edge, but they're maybe missing those one or two key experiments. To your point, maybe that in vivo experiment, a little bit harder for clinical. Maybe we could touch on that in a sec, but there's a lot of those types of mechanisms that are usually hidden, that the classic, day-to-day, scientist and researcher may not be thinking of, but, they're there, right? I'd say for us, when we spend a lot of time dialoguing with founders at those earliest stages, we try to be pretty explicit and specific with our feedback. And so if the data is missing, often, especially if it's in an area that we think is going to be a new frontier, right, that may be coming from that white space, we try to be helpful and thinking through what does that data need to look like, especially if someone is going to go off and do those experiments. And that way, maybe they'll come back and then the data will be in hand. And look, it may be perfect at that point. That may be 3 months, it may be 2 years, who knows, right? But that's kind of part of the journey, right? Is keeping your head down and working on it. So I'd say there's definitely multiple mechanisms out there if you know that you should go look for them. And you always need more data, I think, unfortunately. So it's just finding that right sweet spot, right?
Yeah. Well, it's good to hear that there's somewhat of a consultative process as well, which kind of leads into, when you invest, how you kind of support the companies. And maybe, Nandita, a hypothetical situation for you, once you've decided, let's say you found the company you love, you're now going to invest. What does the relationship look like with the founders with you post-investment?
Yeah, I think it very much depends on are the founders going to be part of the company as a part of the management team, or are they going to be more supporting the company from a scientific perspective, like being part of the scientific advisory board? If there is the decision made between the investors and the founders, they're going to be part of the management team, and they're going to, and if it's their first company, like what we do is we always take board seats. The idea is that for the early companies, we help in shaping the strategy as well as working through and understanding, if it's a platform company, do you have the right application in place to be able to show that the platform works, as well as are you showing differentiation, right? And also understanding, if you've just done a seed investment, like what is it that you're going to need to get to go out for the Series A? Like, how do you storyboard? How do you get there? And how quickly do you need to start talking to other investors? Because it's always good to start to have discussions with other investors and telling them your story, even if you don't have the full data package, just to keep people warm and for them to know that data is coming. Or also bringing pharma into the discussions, because a lot of the times pharma is willing to have discussions very early and can be very, very helpful in helping you validate validate your platform or your technology, or doing a partnership with the company to help them get non-dilutive financing. So we try to work very, very closely with the company. We try to provide resources for the founders as much as possible from our network, as well as within the fund. We have tons of resources that we can support our companies with. So that's kind of how, once we've invested, it's not, for us on the venture side, it's not about capital only, it's about sweat equity as well.
What about you, Arti? Do you, tend to be an advisor, a board member, a co-builder? How do you interact post-investment?
Yeah, I think very similar and almost to a T to a lot of what you just heard from Nandita. When we do all of our investments, we almost always take board seats. It's for lack of a better word, almost a mandate and requirement, and potentially observer seats. And the reason for that is really, when you get an investment from Qiming, kind of echoing some of the comments here, you get the whole network and then all the firepower, if you will, from the team. And so that may not necessarily be just directly from the board member, which of course we do take those board seats, but from our board observers who may join, and then our advisory network and venture partner network that consists of professional biopharma executives and key opinion leaders in their own respective sectors, many of whom have a wealth of experience in oncology and immunology. Of course, if we go in that a little bit earlier, and we do quite a bit of company building, and every so often there's a need to start the company from scratch. I think both of our groups have an appetite and an ethos for doing that. And similarly there, if we need to, we'll happily roll up our sleeves and step into the company. And on a personal note, I've had the honor of doing that a few times, right, where we got so convicted in something that's coming out of an academic institution where we'll go side by side. We're not just going to be a check that comes into the effort, but we're going to bring that hands-on day-to-day execution and operational expertise to really uplift the effort and really get it going, if you will, in a professional manner. So it's a hard journey. So all the firepower you can get, we try to offer for sure.
I like that head-to-head piece example. And actually following up on that, in that first year of investment, what are some of the biggest challenges you help founders overcome in that critical first year?
I think,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
Okay. No, I think for the first year, I think the key is making sure that we've got the right application figured out, right? Because that's really the key, because that kind of sets the tone for the company. And working with the team to be able to do that, we work a lot with refining what that application looks like, what would that target product profile look like, what are the experiments you will need, like the IND enabling studies you would need, like everything you can think of, we can like kind of help put that work together with the company to kind of put that strategy together. And then a lot of the times you're also looking at recruiting experienced drug development talent into the company, because you may have a couple of pieces in place, especially with the early companies. But as the companies are building, you want to make sure not only do you have like the right scientific lead, but you also have the right operational leads in terms of, do you have the right strategy folks around the table? Do you have the right finance folks around the table, et cetera, who can kind of like see down the pike for, what the company is going to be raising and what their strategy would look like down the road. So I think a lot of it is making sure you're setting the company up for success, and doing that both from a, setting them on a path of like what their application looks like and can they execute, and getting that right execution team in place.
Yeah, maybe the only thing to add to that is making sure the execution happens on a timeline that matches the capital that's been raised, right? Especially in the earliest days, it's not uncommon for companies to raise, 12 to 18 months worth of money, right? And in general, I think biotech operates right down like an 18-month timeline, right? Every 18 months, you're kind of like thinking about raising more money.
Yeah.
And so especially in that first, inaugural year, if you will, right? Is the application that you're thinking of going to get you that killer data that you need to get to the next inflection point? And realistically speaking, are you going to be able to do it on that timeline? And I think that's where sometimes folks who come straight from universities or first-time founders who are maybe accustomed to one certain type of speed, kind of struggle. And then, of course, they know what they know, and so it's not a fault, right? And the speed and the execution timeline does have to change a little bit when you go into the industry sense. And certainly making sure that the company and the team, and the founders working side by side with them to understand, is this overly, elongated, potentially really complicated experiment actually the key experiment to do? And then are we being realistic that, things always take longer and more money? Can we actually do it on the timeline that we're going to say we do it? Because before you know it, you're staring at that, cash out, and then you got to go back to your investors. So that comes before you know it.
Yeah. Why don't we actually delve a little bit into what the current state of the market is actually? So maybe Arti, could you, let us know what you're seeing just with regards to investment sizes in the seed stage, and has it changed over the course of the past year, and what may be driving some of those things?
Yeah, and I think there's so many amazing groups that put out really awesome both quarterly, biannual and then annual reports, and just to reference, I think the most recent one that I was reading from the great team at Oppenheimer, I think the numbers will say that activity in the first half of 2025 has been a little bit slower, comparatively speaking, in terms of deal making and deal quantity compared to prior years. The numbers in terms of actual capital raised, at least on face value, seem to be pretty high, right? But once you really dive into the data, and as these guys have done a great job doing, you start to appreciate that we're seeing a lot more companies raise first-time financings, whether they're called seeds or Series A's, that look more like $200 million versus $15 million or $5 million.
Yeah.
And, besides the point that the nomenclature is a little bit confusing, right? A seed that's $200 million. The fact is that I think what we're seeing is coming out of the COVID bubble, where there was this explosion of biopharma interest and a lot of generalist investor capital entering the space. Most of those folks have unfortunately exited on the downturn, and so there's a little bit of a reset that's happening. And so unfortunately, seeds and Series A's in the kind of classic sense, right, of raising anywhere between a couple million to 15-ish million as a seed financing, or the more classic 30 to 70 million Series A. I think those numbers are a little bit down, but maybe to kind of point to a brighter future, to maybe my opening comment, if you can't predict a market trend, that's today. And folks should be building for tomorrow, and trying to stick to their guns and their theses that hopefully both market trends and investor sentiment will change. Ultimately, entrepreneurs are doing the hard work and trying to solve the hard problem, and you can't kind of listen to what the market is saying. So despite the fact that things are a little bit trickier, especially in the earlier side of investing, where these large mega rounds are being raised from clinical stage assets that get licensed from a lot of different avenues, as opposed to being homegrown at universities, like many of the listeners here are probably going to be from. It doesn't mean that there's not a future that doesn't return in full swing. And certainly historically, we've seen time periods over the last 2 decades where that was the thing, right? And maybe the last thing to say there is, this kind of comes back to knowing your audience, right? If and venture capital firms come in all shapes and sizes, our respective groups, I think, are keen to think about earlier stage opportunities. There are certainly other funds who generally go a little bit later. And so knowing your audience is super important if you're going to go and talk to investors. Just being mindful of both your own time and others. But
I think the only thing I would add on this one also is that, one of the things we need to think about is that biotech is going to be here because we're here to help solve health problems for us. So there's if you just go back to baseline, first principles, yes, we're seeing trends, and to Arti's point, these are trends. At the end of the day, we're going to need, therapeutic solutions, and maybe things will be slightly different in how we operate over the next 10 years, but is the industry going to go away? No, that's just not a thing that's going to happen. So,
yeah. Well, we talked a little bit about the 12 to 18-month timeline, and sort of the inflection points and the milestones that you want to see companies achieve. And Nandita, maybe I'm going to combine 2 questions into one. But what are those milestones that you look for? And do you typically reserve money and capital for additional follow-ons?
We do. So just to start with the last question, the idea, given the Whale Multi-Strategy Fund, the whole point of us is that we can do early stage investing and we can carry you through all the way, right? So the idea is to give a little bit, de-risk, add more as the de-risking, happens over time. So how do I kind of see that? It's essentially, one of the points that Arti was making early on, right? Ensuring that what we have asked to see delivered in that 12 to 18-month horizon actually happens. That means our investment thesis, if the biology has played out, we've been able to see the mechanism having been proven early on, right? There's no reason for us not to invest. We will invest. We will then look to see what the next 12 to 18-month horizon looks like. Is that our IND enabling studies done? Are you getting into clinical, are you getting into the early clinical studies? If all of that plays out, we're going to go to the next, which is doing your full-on efficacy studies and going into, getting efficacy and safety data. So for us, it's for, the way we look at investments, it's very much like that. Is the thesis actually playing out as we thought it would? Now, the only thing I would caveat there is, you might have wanted to, when you put the thesis together, the competitive landscape could have been X, and you thought that you were going to be highly differentiated. That competitive landscape can change over time. And even though you're doing all that you're supposed to do and you're meeting your milestones, somehow the value prop has changed on you, and that is an external environment related aspect. So that can sometimes be very hard to understand for folks who are like working and like keeping their heads down and getting the data. But I can say that for like cell therapy, right? Like it's very, very hard to essentially invest in a cell therapy company today because all the changes that we're seeing are very much incremental in that space. And unless we can break through into the solid tumor side of things, it's very hard today to like invest in a cell therapy play that is looking to make, incremental changes on the heme malignancy side of things. So that's kind of how as long as you're meeting your milestones and the investment thesis stays intact and the landscape stays open and you can show differentiation, I see, no issues with investors who are in the company and investors externally, like funding.
Arti, how about you guys? Do you participate in follow-ons? Do you look for syndicate partners? Or do you help companies sort of get creative in their sort of next round of funding?
Yeah, I think similar, we're not a one and done fund, at least we try not to be, right? To all the points that Nandita mentioned, when we put in one check, it's always with the thought that we have a pot of, cash that's reserved for follow-on financings, because generally speaking, companies need to raise multiple rounds. There's some exceptions, but generally, we have a little bit of an ability, and there have been instances where we've put a little bit of money to work on our own to, really get that final, inch, if you will, of data, or that final kind of turn of the data card to complete the thesis to, enable a full investment in a larger scale. But generally speaking, we try to synchronize with like-minded investors. And again, this comes back to that network effect, right? Who not only think about building companies the right way, but can continue to support the companies for longevity, right? You're so right that Nandita, that there's this external factor that, it's like this black cloud that sometimes is there, sometimes it isn't, and you never know. And it's somewhat tough to plan for that, and maybe we'll touch on that in the parting thought. As to how to plan for that, but yeah, we try to be hands-on, supportive, and long-term holders.
Well, in speaking of parting thought, maybe our last question, and especially for the founders on the line, it's a tough funding environment, right? Funding squeeze in biotech. What strategies, what advice would you offer, to help them get through this, rough time or tough time? Nandita.
Okay, yeah, I can start. So I think one of the biggest things is to show capital efficiency, right? Trying to do more with less is like the key right now. Like if you can extend your runway and, dollars that were able to previously, you would show maybe in vivo proof of concept. Now, if you can get to DC somehow, trying to be as capital efficient as you possibly can is key. So one of the biggest ways you can be capital efficient is by being focused. So being very, very focused is, think about clear milestones that you have to achieve in that 12 to 18 month milestone time frame that we were talking about. And then as much as possible, and I do think pharma is out there and looking, as much as possible, if you can get non-dilutive capital, that is key as well. And I've seen this quite a bit recently. There has been a lot of interest from pharma in the early stage investing side, partly because they want to make sure they're supporting the biotech industry, and partly also they've also realized like the earlier they come and shape the programs and strategies that can be helpful for them for later on when they're looking to acquire. So I definitely think that like if you can get to those strategic finance and strategic partnerships, that's a key.
Arti?
I'm not sure I can follow up on that. Those are totally echo all of that. I think we live in a world where, we need to be efficient across the board with everything. And so, getting every little bit of all resources is key. I'd say, there's likely people on this call who have been working on a problem that they may have talked to investors about, and they've had a lot of people tell them no. And I think my parting thought would be that, again, to reemphasize, it's really hard to predict a market trend. It's our job to do it, and we often get it wrong, right? And sometimes we get it right, which is great, but we often get it wrong. And so certainly, I think the message I'd say is, for those who are head down working on a problem, understand your problem, know it in and out, so that if and or when the time comes, whether it's through your own data or through that external factor, you're right in position, right? Because timing is everything. Serendipity is a real thing. There are, multiple stories of success in this industry where on the order of days or weeks, a pivotal moment occurred because the timing was there and people were prepared. So don't try to squeeze yourself into someone else's trend, and know your problem inside and out. Try to come up with the best type of solution, and hopefully things will come together in a capital efficient way, as Nandita said.
Nice. I think that's a perfect spot to end right there. Nandita, Arti, thank you both so much for such an engaging and insightful discussion. I hope it's clear to all the listeners there that, working with investors like yourself is so much more than just a check. And that, working with firms like yours, there's support, across the entire sort of life cycle of the company and the networks you bring, et cetera. So thank you to everyone who joined us for today's program, and a special thank you to all of our speakers, their thoughtful contributions and expertise. And we look forward to continuing this important conversation in future sessions. So thank you.